For the low cost of $625 million per year, you too could bring down a nuclear superpower. Well, maybe not today. Times are changing a little bit. But back in the 1980s, Operation Cyclone proved to be one of the most effective proxy wars in American history. Of course, it's not all sunshine and roses. As the old saying goes, if you want to bring down a superpower, sometimes you got to fund a few jihadi groups, or something like that. Back in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan on Christmas Eve, which was kind of a jerk move in a few ways, but after years of infighting, chaos, and assassinations among Afghanistan's leadership, the Soviet Union went in with the goal of stabilizing the government to secure future cooperation between the two nations. Which, I mean, technically, the leader of Afghanistan, Hafizullah Amin, did request, but he and the Soviet Union had kind of different plans, which was made clear on December 27th when GRU and FSB units wearing Afghan uniforms stormed the Taj Beg Palace and killed him. The Soviet Union then massed around 100,000 soldiers in Afghanistan and pretty quickly began to learn why the country is known as the graveyard of empires. Now, I could poke fun at the Soviet leadership here, saying they didn't learn their history. They underestimated the Afghan fighters and were outlasted by an insurgent force, but don't really have a leg to stand on there anymore. This was peak Cold War. The United States had just left Vietnam and were on the lookout anywhere around the world where they could do a little damage to the Soviets. There was already a resistance movement inside of Afghanistan before the Soviet invasion. And given that the current Afghan government was friendly with the Soviet Union, it was pretty tempting for the CIA to get involved. And they did, just a little bit. In early 1979, they spent around $700,000 to provide medical equipment, communications gear, and cash to a few key resistance groups. But no stingers. Not yet. But when Soviet troops set foot on Afghan soil, the CIA upped the ante, starting a program known as Operation Cyclone, which provided weapons and training to Mujahideen fighters with the goal of killing Soviets. Mujahideen loosely means those who engage in jihad, and was a term broadly used to describe the entirety of the Afghan resistance against the Soviet invasion. And while there were some religious extremists involved, most groups are better described as Afghan nationalists. Operation Cyclone had a few stages. In the early years, roughly 79 to 85, a major focus was keeping U.S. fingerprints off this whole deal, running it totally covert. In turn, everything ran through Pakistani intelligence. Definitely some pros and cons with that approach. The U.S. was able to stay just far enough away to maintain deniability, but with that came a lack of control as to where the weapons went. Short term, not that big of a problem. Long term, bit of a headache, and more on that uncomfortable subject here in a minute. So at that point, it was effective, doing the trick. They were keeping the Soviets fighting and suffering casualties at a greater rate than expected, all for pretty cheap. And best of all, the origin of these weapons and supplies was just murky enough to where none of this was coming back on the United States. If it had stopped there, Operation Cyclone would have been comparable to quite a few other covert programs throughout history. But in 1985, the U.S. took the gloves off. When President Reagan announced his Reagan Doctrine in 1985, that opened the door for the United States to send bigger, more advanced weapon systems to the Mujahideen. In short, Reagan was shifting from the old policy of containing the Soviet Union to one of rolling back their influence anywhere around the world. And for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, that meant Stinger missiles. The first Stinger anti-aircraft missiles arrived in Afghanistan in 1986, a full 7 years after the war began. Now, there was some concern about how effective these heat-seeking missiles would be against modern Soviet aircraft and how well the Mujahideen could operate them. But that was pretty quickly all answered when 3 out of the first 4 Stingers fired brought down Soviet gunships. And just like that, the entire war had changed. Up until this point, the Soviets completely owned the skies. They could fly whenever they want, wherever they wanted, and rain down hell on earth across military and civilian targets alike. But the introduction of effective surface-to-air missiles forced those gunships further and further away. It's kind of surprising, I know, but those pilots wanted to survive. So in turn, they started flying at higher altitudes and greater distances, which severely impacted their ability to influence the battlefield. This allowed the Mujahideen to stay in the fight in a war that would eventually cost the lives of 14,000 Soviet soldiers. By this time, trouble had been brewing on the Soviet home front for quite a while, and in 1989, the Red Army was withdrawn from Afghanistan. And while failure to subject Afghanistan from their rule was not the sole cause of the Soviet collapse in 1991, it did play a significant factor. The losses inflicted by the Mujahideen were so substantial and unexpected that the government tried to keep it a secret in order to maintain this image of the mighty Red Army. But it didn't work. Eventually, news came out. Mothers of the fallen began to protest, and the Afghanistan debacle added to the list of issues from which the Soviet Union just couldn't survive. And everyone lived happily ever after. Well, that would have been nice. Unfortunately, Afghanistan spiraled into a deadly civil war that would eventually lead to the rise of the Taliban, and in the process of funding this war, the U.S. helped to empower a few less than savory characters. I'll start with the big one and where rumors still circulate today, Osama bin Laden. While there's no concrete evidence that bin Laden received any funding or weapons from these CIA-backed programs, he was in Afghanistan during that time and was fighting the Soviets. Kind of. I mean, he tended to exaggerate what he did in this war, and compared to some Afghan groups, he really didn't do much at all. The theory that bin Laden was on the U.S. payroll tends to come through a bunch of secondhand accounts. So it's, somebody saying bin Laden once told me this, or an ISI officer suggested that kind of thing. The argument against the U.S. or CIA having funded bin Laden is that he showed up to this war pretty late, like 1986, 1987 timeframe, at which point the CIA and ISI already had a pretty solid stable of groups they were working with. In fact, there was never enough money or weapons to fully outfit the existing groups, so it's not clear why a new organization, especially one made up of foreign, non-Afghan fighters, would somehow jump to the top of the list, getting that equipment before already proven and vetted partners. Now, there was enough weaponry floating through Afghanistan in the 1980s that it's pretty naive to think that bin Laden and his camp didn't at some point get their hands on U.S.-provided equipment, but that's a little bit different than being directly on the CIA payroll. Bin Laden aside, the U.S. did provide weapons and training to a handful of individuals that turned out to be quite the headache. So Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was one of the top recipients of CIA-directed funds during the Soviet-Afghan War, and he went on to maintain pretty close ties with both the Taliban and al-Qaeda even after the U.S.-led invasion in 2001. His Hezb Islami group was labeled a terrorist organization by the United States and regularly carried out attacks against U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Even worse, though, is the connection with Jalaluddin Haqqani. Haqqani was also at the top of the list in terms of receiving weapons, training, and funds during the Soviet war in Afghanistan, and Haqqani went on to serve as a pretty key facilitator between the Taliban and al-Qaeda. In fact, his Haqqani network proved to be one of the most effective and deadly insurgent organizations during the U.S. war in Afghanistan, responsible for countless U.S. and coalition deaths. So even the most effective proxy war in American history left a little bit of wreckage that's still being cleaned up today. But again, for $625 million per year, that's a pretty good price to bring down a superpower.